Start Excel if necessary. Open the file Excel L1 from the location where you store your data files and then save it as Excel L US sales. The worksheet contains the year's sales information for the Quest's US branches, including the product ID, the category, branch, quarter, and sales. The records are sorted by the branch. You decide to see what pivot tables Excel recommends for your data. So click the Insert tab, click the Recommended Pivot Tables button in the Tables group, and then click each of the recommended pivot table layouts in the left side of the Recommended Pivot Tables dialog, scrolling if necessary. The Recommended Pivot Tables dialog box opens, displaying the recommended pivot table layouts that summarize your data. You decide to create your own pivot table, so click the blank pivot table at the bottom of the dialog box. A new blank pivot table appears on the left side of the worksheet, and the pivot table fields appears in a pane on the right. You populate the pivot table by clicking field checkboxes in the pivot table's field list, often called the field list. The diagram area at the bottom of the field list represents the main pivot table's area to help you track field location as you populate the pivot table. You can also drag fields among the diagram areas to change the pivot table's layouts. Now click the branch field checkbox in the field list. Because the branch field is a text rather than a numeric field, Excel adds branch names to the rows of the pivot table. And adds the branch field name to the rows area of the bottom of the field list. Now click the product ID checkbox in the field list. The product ID information is automatically added to the pivot table, and the sum of the product appears in the values area in the diagram box. But because the data type of the product ID field is numeric, the field is added to the values area of the pivot table, and the product ID values are summed, which is not meaningful. Instead, you want the product IDs as column headers in the pivot table. Now click the sum of product ID list arrow in the values area at the bottom of the pivot table fields list, and then choose Move to Column Labels. The product ID field becomes a field column label, causing the product ID values to appear in the pivot table as the column headers. Now drag the quarter field from the top of the pivot table fields and drop it below the branch field in the rows area at the bottom. Select the sales field checkbox in the pivot tables list and then save the workbook. Now you have created a pivot table that totals US sales with the product IDs as column headers, branches and quarters as row labels. Sum is the Excel's default function for data fields containing numbers. So Excel automatically calculates the sum of the sales in the pivot table. The pivot table tells you that Miami sales of the product 110 were twice as the New York sales level and more than 3 times as the Chicago sales level. Product 340 was the best selling product overall, as shown in the grand total row. Now save your work.